Here, you're in the space. You all look amazing. I'm always excited to have these opportunities. I've been so looking forward to this conversation with George. George, how we doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you very much. I'm a little concerned about the number of people standing. There are some lovely seats here as well if anyone would like to use them. But otherwise, apart from that slight fear on purely politeness basis, I'm doing well.
I love it. Thank you for being British. Now, as we dive into this content, I think first and foremost, so name of the book is Power Play, and I'm just kind of curious, like when you started to write this and think about what this book is, what was sort of your impetus for like, I need to get this on paper and put this out into the world?
One of the obvious impetus was I love a great pun, and you start with a pun and work back from there. The actual impetus for it was something that developed over the course of a few years. So I used to be the head of campaigns and communications at UKI, the Video Games Trade Association in the UK. And what happened during my time there, I was working there during COVID, and various government departments started to work with us on things like public health messaging. Then in 2022, a British government department asked whether or not we wanted to insert pro-Ukrainian messages into the Russian releases of British video games. And I had to tell them no, because they had just informed developers that they needed to leave the country as part of the wider sanctions regime. But in the years that followed, I came across a paper from Sweden's Psychological Defense Agency saying video games were being used as a channel for malign influence. Then I was invited to an event by the Department of State exploring this same topic. And then eventually Trump was re-elected, and the only polling firm in the US to correctly call his victory and the precise count of his electoral college votes was the only one that was polling people via in-game adverts in mobile games, because they were the only ones who had spotted that there was an entire group of people whose information ecosystem was video games and they were not being reached. And so I thought, we need to write about this. And here's the book.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. No, that's very good. So I'm detecting a theme of gaming, tech, and democracy. It sounds like the overarching kind of idea behind it. I'm curious, so you mentioned unpack and other stuff. So in running the gamut, what are the ways we can look at gaming and tech and democracy and where it sort of intersects these sort of different veins of society where people interact?
Sure. So I think the easiest way to start this is to say, what is the role that video games actually serve within the digital landscape? And they used to just be considered products, something that people would play. And what they've transformed into is the digital equivalent of the third places that we inhabit in the world, places like this, where the only way that games have been able to function as they do in the modern world, in terms of their reach into audience, in terms of the connection that brings people together, and in terms of just simple functionality, like how on earth do I get past this level, has been evolving a massive digital information ecosystem that sits around them. And so when you look at the impact of video games across the social media that sits around every single video game, whether it's the Reddit forums, the Discord forums, whether it's YouTube, you really quickly find that video games is actually the dominant conversation on social media. If you go onto Reddit, the top two subcultural Reddits in the world are R Gaming and R World News. If you go onto YouTube, it's 6 billion hours of YouTube content about video games consumed every single month, the top vertical outside of music videos. And if you look at something like Roblox, there's 9.6 billion messages shared every day within the platform. So what happens when people talk? Well, people form identities. What happens when people form identities? They form group. And what happens when groups form? They politicize. And the consistent theme across the book, and where this ties into democracy, is to say Western democracies became familiar with video games in the 1980s and 1990s when they were products that were sold to young men and children. And so there's a tendency to treat video games as trite, as disconnected, as antisocial. But when you look at things like autocracies, if you look at modern populists, and if you look at modern violent extremists, they simply say, where is influence? And they look at these spaces with enormous numbers of people in there who are talking, communicating, and go, that's where power is. And they seek to control these spaces, co-opt them for their own ends, or in some cases collaborate with them to achieve their objectives.
No, and what's intriguing to me about that, something you're hitting on that I know we've talked about, that and Take has talked about a lot too, is we think about games becoming these third spaces, and the future of social becoming gaming, only because the future of social is going to be shared experiences. And as we see that start to evolve, I'm kind of curious, like how you could see these third spaces evolving, forming, and this could be good or bad, conceivably. And what is the overall potential impact, not just on society, but potentially democracy too?
Yeah, so in terms of how the spaces are going to continue to evolve, I mean, I think we've actually got quite an established pattern, and it's something I talk about in the book around the development of the online layer. And it was the former chief executive of RuneScape who said, we have this onion-like layer of communication around the game where different people are in different layers. So you might have the obsessives at the heart of it, but you're also going to have plenty of people who are, less engaged that still want to be hearing about what's going on in this space. And sorry, are we getting a bit of feedback on my mic? I'm just having a little bit of check. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out. It's not too bad. There we go. Are we all okay? Very good. But what we're seeing is that actually there are these really deep layers where you have the groups in the middle who are incredibly passionate and often very capable campaigners. And what they're able to do is amass a lot of influence because they work together to talk about issues within the digital spaces. And then they start projecting that out into various places. If you go to someone like X, the consistency with which you see video games topics trending on there, I think it gives you a sense that these activists in the middle can shape it. But then you also have those groups on the outside, like with RuneScape, of past players who no longer play the game, but still want to have their voice heard and their opinion in there. And there's two things that are important about this. It shapes the way dynamics work in terms of games, in terms of how our communities function. And this was particularly the case with the chapter about populism and what Steve Bannon intuitively understood, is the way that information was flowing backwards and forwards through those communities applies just as much for video games as it does for every other community shaping society. So if you learn how those communities operate, if you fold them into your movement and you give them the value that other people like democracies aren't, they can become really powerful campaigners for your cause.
Yeah, especially a group that you can sort of just activate, like prime with information, other stuff. Like when I was at TikTok a few years ago, there's a lot of data around how many young people got their news off of TikTok and not traditional media sources. And then number within a year, it jumped over 60% at some point. It was pretty incredible. And so you think about gaming in the same way, like you may show up to talk about your game or other stuff, and slowly, what is your favorite coffee drink, or what other games are you playing, or what's the weather like outside? And so there's a chance to definitely see that kind of spread into those areas. And especially, I think the big danger and everybody's favorite topic, as we talk about more the extremist side of it, and I've had that conversation, like the biggest conversation here about extremism in gaming is mostly that at least that side is very good at talking to young men. It seems to be the side predominantly talking to young men. But yeah, curious, I'd been hard not to talk about that topic in this context, but I wonder if you could share a little bit of information about that and how it's shooting up in these online forums.
Yeah, of course. And I think just to jump back to that point around democracy and information ecosystems. So I spoke to the investigative journalist Elliot Higgins, who runs Bellingcat, the open source site that discovered who shot down the passenger jet over Russia in 2014 and who was responsible for the Salisbury poisonings in the UK. And what he described to me was that information used to be passed down a very narrow top-down column. You would have established news sites at the top of the things and information would be broadcast down. But then suddenly, and with the arrival of digital media, that flattened. So suddenly you had a base where each individual segment, whether it is news, but it could also be video games, it could be whatever particular element of culture, you have a much shorter distance between the person at the bottom and the person at the top, and a general belief that everyone is engaged and equal within here. But it also meant that everyone's information ecosystem started to spread out and started to fragment and started to go into ever smaller, basically, spaces. And this matters in the context of violent extremism and its link to video games, because there's a dichotomy here, which is video games do not cause people to be violent. So why have there been over 30 mass casualty incidents in the last 5 years with video game references included in the attack itself or within manifestos? And the answer is actually about this point around co-option, is in a world in which violent extremist ideologies are starting to become more chaotic, where people are cherry picking from different areas to build their own ideology of violence, what happens is that they are still looking for a group. And what they do is they look at video games through the lens of the other people who are in their communities, young men who are often very online. And so the adoption of those video game aesthetics is very similar to what happened in the UK in football culture with a subculture called of football hooligans, where incredibly violent, nihilistic young men claim to be football fans to give themselves an excuse to fight. And I think a very similar thing has happened there within that space. But many of the grievances that are being nursed to create the generation of extremists are also, if you look at it higher up the funnel, the kind of things that populists are targeting in terms of political influence. And if you look at Russia and disinformation campaigns, it's also the same group, the same area of concerns, those same vectors for attack that they're targeting too.
No, and that was the same even a few years ago. We see it's almost like a playbook being repeated across different societies, political structures, particularly after whether it's America, the UK, Europe, or kind of been bad actors integrating. But all is not lost. Now, be it positively uplifting the room with that conversation. The idea, like there's stuff we can do, and many of you in here know this because you work on this exact topic, or you have worked on this topic, and you're aware that efforts are being made. And I'm curious to speak, in light of this, doom and gloom moment, so to speak, there is hope and opportunities. Yeah. What are things we can do? How can we approach this issue in a way that it kind of helps limit or mitigates a lot of this risk, or just starts to devalue a lot of this messaging that's appearing up in the space?
Yeah, a friend of mine read the book and said it was peak bleak at one point, which I was like, oh, thanks. Which is ironic because I've loved video games my whole life. I've worked in the industry for the past 15 years. I literally represented the UK industry and talked about its story. My aim with this has been to be the critical friend, to be the person who can go, the idea that video games cause violence is ridiculous, but there's something going on here. The idea that video games cause a sort of a form of addiction in the form of gaming disorder is not right, but there is something there of concern. It's to be that critical friend. But in terms of trying to look at this through that more positive lens, so the first most positive lens is that we have, broadly speaking, done very little about this from a democratic perspective. We have an enormous amount of people in this room who have worked on various things that I talk about in the book in terms of censorship, in terms of disinformation, in terms of dealing with violent extremism. But I also probably think I can look at everyone in this room and get a feeling that you've worked sometimes like you are pushing up a hill with a boulder in front of you where your organization is like, sorry, why are we talking about video games? Like, aren't they just things for kids? Or having that moment where you're trying to fight for your budget, you're trying to fight for the reason why you do things. I'm hoping that this book is basically the thing you can hand to people and go, this is why you need to do this. This is why we must do this. Because if we don't, we do not have a counter to an enormous amount of influence work and influence operations happening within this space. And I think the other thing about it is to say, and I put this in the conclusion when I'm talking about how we start to solve some of these problems, I say that particularly when it comes to tech policy, we've tried the panic like idiots approach to solving problems, and you know what? It hasn't worked. We need to actually start thinking less about, if we're talking about things like social media bans, we need to be thinking less about locking up access to the building and saying, what do we need to do to change norms in the space? What do we need to do to develop things like civil society layers, like public information campaigns, digital literacy, education, to actually start tackling these problems here? Because for a very long time, we haven't made the argument for our democratic rights. We haven't made our argument for why democracy matters, for why it's important to defend these things. And that is depressing. But it also means that it gives us some very obvious, quick things to do. And I think if we start doing those kinds of things, they can make a big difference.
No, and even just knowing about that. So in the U.S., if you're familiar with the school system, one of the systems we have for discipline is called in-school suspension. So if you do something really bad, they don't want to suspend you from school. They send you to a room far off and away with another teacher, and you just hang out there for the day. And that's your punishment. Think of it like detention on steroids. And we got a new vice principal, and vice principals in the U.S. oversee discipline, and the vice principal you hired had gone to this school, had graduated from this school, and her first job was to be in charge of in-school detention, and she had no idea it existed. And she had no idea it existed because she'd never gotten in trouble. And so with that lens, it's kind of informed some of my thinking about online safety. Like if you don't deal with that, like, myself and my kids, I'm grateful my kid, he plays games, but he hasn't really come across any of this stuff, but I ask a lot of questions about it. So if you don't see it, it's hard to know how big this problem is or what it could be.
Yeah.
And you all get to see data for your platform. You see data on the back end, so you have kind of a sense of what's going on. And you work with partners who specialize in stuff. You kind of know about it. Like to that end, that's why I think it's so important to sort of have this ecosystem of support. Because you think about the layers, like one thing G4C does very well, and Representative Thai, we have researchers, we have platforms, we have safety providers and others who are working on this type of issue. How does that ecosystem and what you've seen or observed so far kind of play into this idea of collectively trying to work towards a solution on this problem?
Yeah, so I often go back to the example of football in England because I'm British and I love football. So that's a starting point. But so you look at what happened with football hooliganism in the UK, and in the 1980s you saw football cultures becoming increasingly violent, and you saw regulators respond by trying to crack down harder and harder on football communities. And what happened was a series of disasters, some of which were led by hooligans, so like the Heysel disaster in Belgium, which killed dozens of Italian football fans. But then it culminates in the Hillsborough disaster, in which 97 Liverpool fans are killed as a result of a crush at the stadium that is largely caused by the institution believing that all football fans are violent because they're all hooligans, and building an infrastructure that ultimately is, one, dangerous for them, and two, culturally leads to the police treating football fans in such a way that it corrals them into these spaces. And what happens after Hillsborough is, and after the public inquiry, there are some requirements placed on football clubs to say you're going to have to rebuild your stadiums to make them safer for your fans. And the football stadiums start looking into this and going, well, the football clubs and going, we can't afford this. So we're going to have to find a new way to fund what we're doing. So they form the Premier League and they sell the broadcast rights. And the broadcasters start saying, well, we want to see full stadiums and we want to see fans having a good time and being safe and those kinds of things. And you see a much deeper investment from football clubs into community initiatives, into things like anti-racism initiatives, into initiatives that begin to support the Pride movement relatively early. And what you see is this combination of regulators creating rules that actually change the playing field in a way that meaningfully forces businesses to engage. But you see businesses in the form of football clubs embrace their role as community stewards. They stop saying just what is happening in the stadium and start expanding that out into the wider world. So if a football fan in a club jersey commits something like a racist attack in the street, they don't just get arrested from it, they also get banned from their football club. And I think one of the things that you see is over the course of 30 years, the Premier League goes from the depths of Hillsborough to becoming the biggest league in the world, the most viewed entertainment sporting products, with a fan base that is more demographically representative of British society than ever before. And I think that's, when looking at this whole society approach, that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking at. And I think if we're talking about specific things as well, the one thing that I would really like games companies to stop doing is to say, well, this happens off platform, because I don't think it does. Because I think realistically, when someone moves from a game to another social media site to go and continue a conversation, they are still your player. They are still in your community. And the values that you create and decide to inculcate in your community are something that should remain robust across every platform they're in, every place that they are. And you as a company should have that kind of ethical responsibility. And I think that's particularly good for dealing with violent extremism, but it should also probably deal with many of the cause issues that lead to other problems in the book. We see consistently throughout the research, things like misogyny is just a constant vector for attack. We see racism, anti-Semitism are constantly used by actors as a vector for attack. We see the oppression of LGBTQ plus groups as another constant. We should not be seeing these as just disconnected issues. They are all part of the same thing, and it's valuable for keeping people safe, but also protecting their rights to be democratic citizens in our spaces.
Yeah, what I love about that, particularly thinking about parasocial behaviors, one of the things in gaming that is absolutely true as in real life. If social structures exist offline, as you talked about just in soccer, these same social structures can exist in games. Behavior is consistent, norms are consistent. Guiding people, showing people, like in your case, creating inclusion, marketing campaigns, all that other stuff, can definitely be translated into a game and environment to kind of foster that same relationship. I'm curious about like that as one aspect, particularly like in translating that into gaming.
Yeah.
How can we utilize that? Because the other option that's been on the table forever is like, you need to ban these accounts. We need to delete this content. Or you need to, it's something to coordinate, with other platforms, but beyond the reactive piece, how can we look at sort of the prevention aspect of it?
So I'd actually like to start an answer to this by showing, I think, an example of what's wrong and what could be easily different instead from recent British political developments. So the country announced that it was planning to introduce a social media ban for under 16-year-olds and was talking about the challenges in the spaces, the problems with algorithmic content, the problems with hate within a lot of these places, and their unsuitability for teens. And what happened was the British government announced this with a statement on X. Culture comes from the top.
Yeah.
Too often we have not set the culture. We have been too driven, often by those noisy groups coming up from the bottom up, because we say the players are our North Star. The players are our North Star. But these smaller groups who've often pressured us, who've often harassed our employees, who've often made it feel unsafe to be in the industry, they are in the minority. You look at something like Sweet Baby Inc. Detected, and you see the Steam group, and you go, there's 300,000 people in that Steam group. That's a lot of people. There's 110 million people on Steam. They're nothing, right? And we have to have that confidence to say, not to allow a minority of aggressive people to determine our culture and to allow us to essentially lead ourselves into strange places where we compromise our values, and to instead say, let's set it from the top. Because amidst all of the understandable complexities around regulatory policy, around technology and how it actually works, we have the basic simplicity of the values that we set are the values that people are more likely to follow. And the more that we can set the values that we want to see in the world and make sure that they are visible, that they are present, that the people who are making games feel supported, that the community managers who are looking after our communities feel looked after, and that the players who, the vast majority of whom subscribe to those same values, feel like that is respected more than those noisy outliers. I think that's key.
Speaking to that, and I know certainly a few folks in this room have been impacted this way. I've worked with professionals, particularly female professionals, who have been in FBI custody because of a moderation decision or because of a game feature shift.
Yeah.
And it's still as much, and probably remember the first Gamergate back in 2015. And I remember sitting then Twitter having a conversation about it, and then just a few years later, it happened again.
Yeah.
So seeing these like kind of patterns repeating and trying to accurately set value statements, taking steps to kind of prevent some of that work from happening and impacting people, because it's anyone else agree this work is hard? Yep. Ryan? Just a little. So I think that's a great point to kind of bring up, and how as we start to shift that and have that values piece in there. I'm kind of curious. I do want to open up for questions here to folks in the room. Kind of my last question, like you've done a lot of these talks, launching the book, PR for the book. I know when you've been in different places, mostly the case so far, I'm going around talking about it. Is there a common theme or question that comes up, or things people want to know, or they're looking to try to understand in order to see like where's democracy going, where games are going? What seems to be the most common thing coming up in these conversations?
A common thing that always comes up is a parent going, oh, good God, this sounds terrifying. Why should I allow my child to be in this space? And the answer is that a lot of what I'm talking about are edge cases. Yeah. But the thing is that those cases on the edge can, especially really multiply out. So I know I talk about the example of, like, for example, Russia weaponizing video games for a propaganda front, in which they're actively trying to goad us into covering them and talking about them to get their talking points out there. But to reassure people and say, the vast majority of games, it's great, it's fun, it's fantastic. But I think that then leads into the other thing, which is, how do we actually help people in general within this space and the digital world more generally? And I think that the biggest thing has been, and this is going back to what I was just talking about in terms of the social media ban, we've had a tendency to obsess over what I'm calling like building safety regulation. Like, have you built the foundations in a certain way? Have you put locks on the door? Are you doing all of this? And then let's say with the social media ban, notionally a 16-year-old can get the code to the keypad and walk into the white supremacist club. It's like, that's not the thing that matters here. It's about how do we create resilient citizens who are able to understand that in a digital landscape, things are probably fine, but there are people trying to influence you. There are people trying to persuade you. There are people who are doing things that are going to not necessarily be in your interest. And how do we build that resilience amongst people through the typical ways that we've done it before? Going back to those public information campaigns, education. So those, I think, are the things that really come up. And the other thing is that people find my name funny because it is the same as a former British politician who is not very positive. So those are the main ones.
There we go. That big in me. No, and it's funny, like my mom talked about that when I was starting this work, when she was in college. There's a very now well-known cult that hovered around her college in the Bay Area called the Moonies. And they would often try to abduct you and take you out. And very bad things happen. I'll let you Google that. But she remembers there was a student on campus and they were trying to essentially recruit her. And my mom came up and just started asking questions and asking questions. She's very good at this. As a mom, it's very annoying, but as successful Delvis, I'm very proud. But she finally can just basically manage to talk through their logic structure and convince them, like show where the logical fallacy was, And the girl came in like, hey, thank you for doing that. Like, I didn't know what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what we're seeing, particularly the rhetoric around banning tech and other stuff. It was the same in '08. As an educator in schools, we're having these conversations. What everyone's saying now is the exact same thing we were saying in '08, 2010, 2013, 2015. But it doesn't get to the core issue. No. So educating, awareness, how would you respond to this? Have you seen this stuff? You just be asking questions. Yeah. You're in tech. How many people in here have ever been asked, would you let your kid play this game? Right? All the time. And then I just pop up with a question like, do you want them to play the game? Like, what are you worried about? And I agree. I think we share those stories to raise awareness. There is a, oh my God, it's everywhere. This is how bad it is. And it's like, no. Like, this is a small piece of the puzzle. And then, like, yes, when you solve for it, overwhelmingly, there's positive data to support that.
Yeah. Absolutely. There we go. You should have written this book instead. It would have been a long exhaustive.
So the book is Power Play by Matt Soeth.
Yeah.